Good morning. My name is Midshipman First Class Amos Stott, and I have the honor of introducing Dr. Robert E. Fishman. Dr. Fishman is a leader in engineering, energy, and national security, serving as a distinguished visiting professor and McNeil Chair in Engineering at the U.S. Naval Academy. He is also the founding director of USNA's Center for Energy Security and Infrastructure Resilience, or CSER for short, which prepares future leaders to address the challenges of energy security and climate change's impact on critical infrastructure. A USNA class of 1973 graduate, Dr. Fishman began his career as a surface warfare officer, serving 8 years on active duty, including tours as a chief engineer and in the immediate office of the Secretary of Defense. Following his naval service, he built a 40-year career in electric power generation, contributing to nuclear, conventional, and renewable energy projects. He has held key leadership roles, including Chief Operating Officer of 3 companies and Chief Executive Officer of both a major conventional power generation corporation and a renewable energy firm. Dr. Fishman holds degrees from USNA, MIT, and the University of Maryland, and is a licensed professional engineer. He also volunteers as a pilot for humanitarian organizations and serves as a museum docent and public speaker on aviation and naval history. We are honored to have him with us here today. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Robert E. Fishman.
Good morning, everyone. I'd like to introduce my panel. I'll start from the far end. Dr. Scott Tinker, Director Emeritus of Bureau of Economic Geology at the Jackson School of Geosciences, University of Texas at Austin. The Honorable Meredith Berger, Assistant Secretary of the Navy for Energy Installations and Environment and Chief Sustainability Officer. Dr. Curtis Swope, Professor of Economics and Associate Dean of the School of Humanities and Social Sciences here at USNA. The Honorable Rita Baranal, Senior Vice President of the AP300 Small Modular Reactor for Westinghouse Electric and former Assistant Secretary, DOE's Office of Nuclear Energy. And Brent Sadler, Captain, USN retired, Senior Research Fellow at the Naval Warfare and Advanced Technology, Douglas and Sarah Allison Center for National Security at the Heritage Foundation. So we've got a lot to talk about this morning, so I'm going to jump right in and start with the correlation between energy and economic and national security. So as Dr. Juergen has pointed out in one of his books, I can't remember which one, because I've read them all, energy security means different things to different people in different nations, depending on their individual circumstances and needs. This morning, we're going to discuss energy security from a national security perspective in the context of the great power competition and as it relates to policies and programs at the intersection of energy and climate change. So I'm going to start with Dr. Tinker. For the benefit of the audience, can you briefly talk about how energy consumption, income levels, and quality of life are interrelated?
You bet. First, it's a real honor to be here with you today, and I appreciate the opportunity and the invitation. And my good friend Dan Juergen did a wonderful job of starting to explain some of these things. So let me just touch on those lightly. I think I first said this in Quito. Energy won't end poverty, but you can't end poverty without energy. And I think the great challenge, the dual challenge, is this concept of lifting all of the world up from poverty, which much of the world still lives in, human flourishing, if you will. It's required for modern life. Energy is required for modern life. It's not just that socket or the gasoline. It's everything in our lives. Nothing is happening here today without energy. We just take it for granted. We're comfortable. The lights are on. We arrived here. My clothes are nice. I'm well fed. It's all energy, every single bit of it. So it's required for modern life. That ties in tightly, energy and income. We'll look at some data later, but if you look at the relationship between access to energy and our gross national incomes or our GDPs or our personal incomes, it's tightly correlated, even causative, as you start to examine it. Without energy, we simply don't have the economies or economic health that we see in the rich world today. And you can, as you go down that scale, you see that globally. So that tight tie between energy and the economy, and then bring it right back to quality of life. I've been fortunate, been in over 60 countries in the world, not just in airports, deep into them. And there is a remarkable level of disparity in human flourishing today. It's not trivial. It's billions of people in different levels of that, and quality of life is directly tied to that. So this relationship, this energy, economic and flourishing relationship is very tight, and that's what security, energy security is all about. And so as we get through today, I look forward to talking about transition and drawing those relationships closely, because if you get out of kilter, if you push too far in any one of those areas, which we often do, you're going to leave the other ones behind. And that's the great challenge, is balancing those.
Thanks. So let's bring it back to the Navy for a second. The Navy's depended on energy using a national and strategic approach since we began with steamships in the mid-1800s. We set up coaling stations, we set up the Naval Petroleum Reserves, we dedicated fuel bunkering in various bases throughout the Pacific. Later, the Navy spearheaded the creation of nuclear power through, at first with nuclear propulsion, and then through the first commercial civilian reactors. So I think the Navy's recognized for a long time that national security and energy security were interrelated. And I guess my first question would be to Assistant Secretary Berger, do we have the right processes in place to generate an energy security plan going forward?
Dr. Fishman, I think it sums up nicely what you were saying, that energy security is mission success. And so I'm going to take 1 second to just pick up on an important point about quality of life too, because one of the important missions that we have for the Navy, for the Marine Corps, is making sure that there is that quality of life, and energy provides that. So that is recruiting and retention for our naval forces, so that we have people to go out and do the work of defending the nation. And so I don't want to lose that point of just how integrated that energy requirement that you noted is to every single step of what we do. And as you know, in some ways, best of all, of course, the Navy's been an innovator when it comes to energy, recognizing that nexus that's there right away. And so part of making that integrated plan is everything from realizing that mission assurance continuity that is there, where is the throughput points of where we have energy dependencies, and what are the missions that we are trying to create. So everything from policy to making sure that we have the right partnerships, to the right investments. That's how you start to make an energy security plan. But I'll point out that we are mostly a grid-facing institution. And so as we look at where our energy comes from, we are reliant a lot of times external to our installations, to our own resources. And so that's where security comes in. You noted that I am a Chief Sustainability Officer. People often forget the security part of sustainability, which is so essential. And that is something that the Department of the Navy lives and breathes every day, is that in order to ensure that we are secure in the resources that we have to go to our partners and make sure that they are following those same security requirements. It is a challenge. And it is a focus area for where we are trying to work together. We have relationships with organizations such as the Edison Electric Institute, the Rural Electric Cooperative, and EPRI, the Energy, I'm going to forget the P, Research Institute. All of whom are looking at these problems and making sure that we are looking through to the end point of where we're relying on security, because you are only as good as you can trace it. That is where redundancy and resilience comes in as well. Logistics is what we do and have to do well. And if you have not thought about where there is a single point of reliance, then you have subjected yourself to a single point of failure, which is not good enough for the way that we work and the missions that we're required to fulfill. And so as we think about renewable energy, we think about resilience, we think about things like islanding. That is part of that security integration and plan. And you noted nuclear, and I'll just make one more point, that just as we found our way with nuclear propulsion, we just last week put out a request for information for shore energy provided by nuclear technology. So we are looking for any and all inputs for those who are developing technology so that we can use that energy, generate community benefit as well, which is important for our defense communities, and make sure that we're not subjecting ourselves to the disruptions that can come through some of our other power sources. So that redundancy, that reliance, and finding places that we can partner with reliable partners that assure that security is how we're looking at making sure that we do have an integrated energy plan.
Thanks. Scott, do you want to add something to that?
Yeah, I think when we have something in place, who is the we, presume the nation. Dan talked this morning about diversity and optionality quite a bit, and I'm a student of that as well. I think processes, the question on processes requires some framework, some agreed to framework. If we simplify what energy security is, it's affordable, it's reliable, and it's sustainable. And wouldn't that be great if we could have all three? But you can't. Okay, those students, I was talking to a couple midshipmen just earlier, if you think of a ternary diagram and put affordable, reliable, sustainable on that triangle, if I want 100% no emissions on that, I don't get much of anything else. It becomes less reliable, more expensive. So it's really finding the balance in that framework in the middle of that I call the radical middle, okay, where you start to look at the trade-offs, you start to look at the options in there, you start to look at compromise. So in our processes, we got to agree on a framework so we can again begin to address that. If we are all binary, if it's all about climate all day, we won't solve these things. Let me say that again so the press can quote it. If it's all about climate all day, we won't solve it. Because it's not all about climate all day. That is important, but it's not the only issue. So I think processes require that we set up a framework that we can all agree to. And secure energy, what we're talking about today, really drives that framework.
Yeah, I completely agree to Dr. Juergen's point. You know, diversity is certainly important in energy sources, but that balance you're talking about of the various competing, there's no free lunch in energy. You know, you have to make trade-offs in order to accomplish your goals. Well, speaking of which, if we're talking about electricity in particular, we're seeing forecasts related to data centers, and particularly AI-driven, of very high growth rates in electricity demand. At the same time, we're trying to do an energy transition to reduce our dependence on fossil energy. So my question first for you, Scott, and then for Secretary Berger is, where's this power going to come from?
The outlet. Oh no, the wall now. You know, we have batteries in the wall. We're laughing in this room, trust me, having spoken all over the world. When I ask that question, quite often people say, well, it comes from the outlet and through a plug. And it's magic. So let me set that this way. Electricity is only about 25% of our global energy consumption. 25%. 75% is lots of other things that we consume energy for. So come to the electricity sector. Where does it come from? Again, if we get too narrow in our choices, we lose the diversity. And that's not secure. Midshipmen taking economics, if you're going to invest in stocks, you don't want just one stock. If you're going into real estate, you don't want to own one. You need a portfolio of things, and we need that in energy as well. There are two big kinds of electricity. There's we call baseload or dispatchable, the things that can be always on, like a coal power plant, a natural gas power plant, a nuclear power plant, hydro, unless there's a drought. And then there's the intermittent or weather dependent, solar, wind, and other kinds of things. And this isn't judgment, it's just physics. The sun isn't always here, like at night. So, or when it's cloudy. And so you have to balance these things, intermittent with so-called reliable. And they can partner quite well. As we think about where it's going to come from, we need to look at multiple options, multiple sources, and stop trying to compete solar and wind against natural gas. Stop trying to compete these things. They all have roles to play. And they're all critical, and they're going to vary by resource. I'm a geologist, and so it's going to vary a lot by resource. I would just kind of leave this thought that the demands on electricity are growing again. We may go from 25 up to as high as 50% of our total energy consumption. But electrons are only one part of energy. We are not going to electrify everything. We have to have molecules. The other half, the molecules for heat, to burn, to make steel and cement, for fertilizers and plastics, the things we use molecules for, we have to have both of these things. And again, let's not get overweight too far down the road, any one of these things. We have enough electricity. We can generate enough electricity with the resources we have. I'm not concerned about it as long as we maintain that balanced portfolio.
Secretary Berger, have anything to add?
Yes, I just wanted to go back quickly to what you said about how it's not climate, and I don't think that you meant to impart a negative connotation there, but it is about being inclusive of those considerations. You can either be a market driver or a market inhibitor, and so by causing divide, we don't get that resilience and diversity that we need to have. Mm-hmm. And so I just wanted to make sure to draw that point back in, that it is about finding the maximum co-benefits and managing an energy transition so that we are being inclusive of all of the pieces that are there. We're doing that on our installations and trying to replicate that. And so looking at areas where we can use, for example, there's a Marine Corps base out in Miramar where we're able to use methane gas for energy generation. We have solar out there paired with battery storage because the sun isn't out all the time. And then we're able to use a microgrid to manage that energy in partnership with the commercial grid so that we can actually pull off an island, creating that resilience, that independence, and that security factor by using sustainable sources and making sure that we don't have that single point of failure, with the added benefit of being able to go out to the community and support them where they suffer a lot of brownouts when it gets too hot and there's too much stress on the capacity that's available. So increasing capacity through sustainable resources that are redundant, and through the redundancy we get that resilience and security, is the integrated thinking of how we figure out where that energy generation is coming from, and hopefully moving in with more resources, managing against what's currently available, because you can't do anything with the flip of a switch. And so that's how we're looking at where that's coming from, but it is partnerships. It's using authorities for the Navy that Congress has given us through enhanced use leases, power purchase agreements, and energy savings performance contracts, so we can access that technology and that diversity, and also show the maximum return on the security, reliability, and making sure that we have that mission assurance that's so essential to what we do.
Thank you. I guess my last question for you, Scott, is, we don't, electricity generation really, I would venture to say we don't have a national energy policy. We have 50 state policies. Yet electricity crosses state lines. How can we get the right people at the table to develop a coherent electrical grid strategy for the United States? If you were king.
Next question. Look, the United States it's a collection of states, and states have a lot of authority in that, and I'm kind of glad about that. I think that's important. None of us are wise enough to determine what the right answer is. I think markets help tremendously in that. Texas has its own grid. It's called ERCOT, the Electricity Reliability Council of Texas. Pros and cons to that. It was developed because Texas, actually in our Constitution, we can secede from the nation if we so choose. It's in our Constitution, and many of you would probably wish that would happen. But I'm kidding. But ERCOT sits here as a little island. It's an interesting example of what the pros and cons of being somewhat isolated. We have a few connectors around that. But how do you pull that together in a coherent way? Again, I think you have to go back to those principles of the reality of electricity, that it doesn't grow. You create electricity. We either create it by making heat from burning coal, burning gas, burning oil, unfortunately, or nuclear. Or we create it by capturing the sun, both the light and the heat from it, the motion of wind, the motion of water, and gravity and other things. None of those are perfect. I think nuclear probably comes closest to being one that can be always on, no emissions, very dense. This concept of energy density is vital. And what that means is bang for the buck. You just get a whole lot more bang for the buck out of uranium and thorium than you do out of batteries, the sun, and the wind. It's physics, again. So you have to balance these portfolios. I think the coherent policy comes in recognizing those different resources, that everybody has some. We have great sun in Texas and great wind as well. Not everybody does. If you want to build solar in Seattle, you're going to be less efficient, et cetera. So you have to have, you can't say this is the policy for everyone because it just varies by geographic region. You have to come together as you think about those things. And then I think it's really important when we use words like clean and green and sustainable, you either mine your energy or you drill it. Okay. I can't put the sun and the wind in my car. I have to make a solar panel. That requires a bunch of mining, manufacturing, and later disposal. I have to make a wind turbine. Same thing. Tremendous amount of mining. Batteries, extreme amount of mining. Again, I'm a geologist. I don't mind mining. But it's not green. Even if we say green mining, it doesn't make it green. Okay? So the amount of mining we'll talk about later is incredible as we transition from what? From drilling to mining. We got to balance these thoughts about what sustainable means and over what time term. Be very clear-eyed about that and very honest about that, particularly with our young people. I gave a TED talk to 1,100 students, and I said throughout the end, I said, there's no renewable energy. It's just a word we use because it comes from the earth, the stuff to collect it. We make it into collection systems, and then we dump them, including batteries, and we do it over again, over and over. That's not renewable. It's just a different strategy to collect the sun and the wind and convert it into useful things. So we have to be very, as we get this national thought in mind, very clear-eyed about the realities of the resource demands, I think, and how we're going to go about that in the electricity sector, making sure that the portfolios are reliable in the long run for that.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Let's shift gears a little bit and talk about how energy figures into the global picture and in the great power competition. So as Dr. Yergin mentioned, the U.S., thanks to fracking, has achieved energy self-sufficiency in oil and natural gas. In fact, we're a major LNG exporter. But our European and Asian allies are still dependent on imported oil. We saw this vulnerability in 2022 when the Russians tried to blackmail the European allies into not helping Ukraine. So my question for you, Curtis, is what measures should we undertake to reduce our allied vulnerability to supply disruption and being coerced by energy exporters?
Yeah, thanks, Bob. Thanks for including me on this panel. First of all, I'd say there's nothing inherently wrong about trade and energy, right? As Scott said, energy production, you look at energy production, you look at trade globally, and you look at the decline in world poverty, and they just run in opposite directions, right? So really the only constraining factor in human development is the availability of energy. And countries are going to have to import energy. It's just bad economics to think that every country is going to be self-sufficient in energy. So I'll say that first. The primary problem, of course, is conflict, right? Conflict disrupts trade. It wreaks all kinds of havoc. And so the first thing we could do is work to end the current conflicts and work diplomatically to prevent them in the future. But having said that, of course, competition is always a good thing. Restriction of trade is not going to reduce the likelihood of conflicts. It's going to increase the likelihood of conflicts. So there's no doubt, as Dan said, that the U.S. liquid natural gas exports to Europe helped to bring down the price of natural gas after the spike following Russia's invasion. So restricting or banning liquid natural gas exports would have no economic or environmental purpose, in my opinion. So it's much greener than the coal that Germany and others are currently relying on to replace natural gas. So again, liquid natural gas is a game changer, and it can significantly improve both energy security and environmental goals around the world for us and for our allies. I'll focus a little bit more on Germany. So Germany's done some amazing things with renewables. On the one hand, it's very impressive. They're producing over 50% of their electricity from renewables, and it's amazing. On the other hand, they also have the second highest, I think, electricity prices in the world. So it is proven to be a little bit of a drag on their economy. But they're a wealthy country, and of course that's their choice. I think they're pressing the limits on what's possible with renewables. I tell my classes always that it's easy to integrate some renewables into a grid. It's hard to really rely heavily on renewables yet with the availability of technology. Just the other costs and requirements for storage and the efficiency losses that you have, storing wind and solar electricity through hydrogen, just makes it impractical for a lot of countries. But Germany's a wealthy country, and they may continue to develop the technology in that area that will benefit everybody. But I'll speak frankly. I also think that the German decision on nuclear power is probably a mistake economically and environmentally. They're much more reliant on coal and natural gas than, say, France and Great Britain. And so, again, that's something that they're struggling with. And maybe they'll rethink that as new technology comes along. I expect they probably will. But I hope that the U.S. and our allies will continue to emphasize, support, and encourage the deployment of things like the small modular reactors in the future. That's the only... and I'll show some reasons why later, but I think that's the only practical pathway to achieving environmental goals and continuing to support the decline in global poverty. It's the only practical solution I see in the future. So, and I hope the U.S. Navy leads the way in that as well. So,
I guess that leads into the question of if we look at our energy infrastructure, both internal to the United States, the grid, and the supply chains for our allies. I mean, how vulnerable is that to attack? And I'll start with Secretary Berger on that.
Well, we've seen as referenced in your question and some of the comments, energy is both a tool and a weapon. And so as we look at those logistics lines and making sure that we are protecting those, it is a challenge, it is a threat, and so it is reducing those dependencies, increasing our logistics lines so that there isn't a single point of failure, is where we need to be, and identifying the vulnerabilities where we are. So we don't always have that ability, especially overseas. And so we're dependent, just like we are here, on the local grids and the local resources, but with a little bit less say, of course, because we have just a little footprint that is considered ours. And so we lose some of those opportunities, but as we look at ways that we can increase that independence and look at the different ways that we can develop technology. I heard both of my co-panelists here talking about the advance of technology, and that's what's really important, is making sure that we are advancing our technology, and it is a managed transition when it comes to energy. And so as we see those steps along the way, we do find ways that we have reliable sources for mining, for all of our other component parts. We shouldn't be in a place where it is total waste forever, and there are people who are working on that are leaders in the industry to understand. General Motors is a great example of some of the recycling and reuse and max benefit use that we can see out of some of these pieces. And so that's important as we operate overseas and in austere and remote environments, so that we aren't looking for those logistic lines. And then also here, so that we are creating the economy and the expertise that allows us to continue to thrive and lead, because that is part of our warfighting advantage. And so as we look across all of these pieces, we are at a critical moment in terms of making sure that we maintain advantage, that we are not compromising our logistics, not leaving ourselves open to vulnerability. And we're not there in every place yet, and that's the hard work ahead.
Thank you. Rita, let's focus on the U.S. electrical grid for a moment and talk about its vulnerabilities and what we can do about it.
So one is to certainly fortify the infrastructure in the United States and to make it more robust. We are seeing the impact of climate events take down very quickly what we come to rely on, to Scott's point, right? We're in a very privileged position and are very accustomed to flipping the switch and everything works as it should. And when it doesn't, so for example, in the state of California, when you are told that you cannot run your air conditioning in the afternoon, or you can't wash your dishes or do your laundry, which my kids wouldn't care about, but some of us do, right? In the heat of the summer, you want to be able to run your air conditioning. When it directly affects you, then people start to realize that, yeah, we've got a problem. We need additional capacity. We need additional fortification for our infrastructure. And I think that certainly eyes have been opened over the past few years in the United States on how fragile our current infrastructure is.
And then, of course, there's the whole issue of vulnerability to cyber attack as well as physical attacks.
Absolutely.
So if you had a crystal ball to get the U.S. grid to a level of resiliency that it should have, you want to put a number on that?
Next question. Can I go back to the cybersecurity piece, if
Absolutely.
I may? So Dr. Yergin talked about AI and data centers, and in the news over the past couple of weeks, it's been a very exciting time for the nuclear industry. We have seen agreements announced with Microsoft and Constellation. And what Microsoft has done is said, we want all of the power from 3 Mile Island Unit 1 to power our data centers. That's over 800 megawatts of output. 3 Mile Island Unit 1 has been shut down since 2019 solely for economic reasons. So Microsoft has come in and said, we want that plant restarted, and we want to buy all of the power. Great news. Google has signed an agreement with Kairos Power out of Alameda, California, again, for data center uses. Yesterday, Amazon announced an agreement with X Energy for purchasing power from their SMRs in the state of Washington. So what is exciting for this industry is that the tech sector is leading the way for deployment of new technology, and they want it in the United States. And if you pull the thread on that, it's better to have the data centers here in the United States and allow that to be rooted here versus elsewhere. Now, I know in the state of Virginia, I think that there are a lot of data centers in the state, and if I go back to our discussion from last night, and I don't like to quote social media, but yeah, if we go back to it, it's more than 50% of the data centers are in this region, and that's a vulnerability, certainly, right? No more data centers are being welcomed unless they bring their own power. And so we've seen an RFI come out from Dominion that has put out a call for small modular reactors into the region to provide, ideally, power for data centers. And I think the RFI that just came out from the Navy as well is similar. And if I can add just a personal note, I started my career developing nuclear fuel for the Navy's aircraft carriers and submarines that are powered by nuclear power. And it's an absolute privilege to be here speaking about nuclear power to all of you. But the RFI that came out just a couple days ago from the Navy brings everything for me full circle. We're talking about terrestrial nuclear reactors still providing support to the Navy, but now on land.
Secretary Berger, I think this ties back into your comment about how we want to make military bases more self-sustaining in energy. How has the concern about the reliability and the availability of power from the national grid affected your thinking on why we need to make our bases more energy independent?
It is the number one consideration in terms of the logistics element. We've got the security, of course, as a necessary component of our installations, but as you look across the state we talked about, each state has its own approach to energy, and so we've got this ecosystem that is inconsistent in terms of the component parts of what makes up any single location's energy providers. You've got different requirements and external factors that come in, whether it is physical attacks, cyber attacks, both of which are possible and have happened, to the aging infrastructure of the grid. So also in the physical category, where we have let things collectively as a nation, I will offer, go beyond their useful life in terms of how that infrastructure is supposed to work and supposed to support and supposed to be maintained and sustained. And in the meantime, we've left that frozen and upped the requirement in so many ways for what we need to be doing. We have data centers, we have aircraft carriers that need service, we have artisan workers across the nation that are building our ships that are in support of our national security mission, our defense, and we have all of our people living, working, learning, training on some of the most incredible virtual training tools that we have. All of this requires so much energy, so much power, and so we're finding increasingly in California, you can't always flip on that switch and rely on it, and our installations there get that call too of, hey, you need to lower your consumption at these points during the day, and there is that hierarchy and that prioritization, and there is no room for us to lessen our focus on mission. And so that is why we need to make sure that we've got that resilience and that redundancy. It's why we're using our land to make sure that we can add to that whole of ecosystem approach to the types of energy supply that we can contribute to the grid. We're not building a whole bunch of energy anytime soon, energy infrastructure anytime soon. But we have our component parts and our installations, but we recognize that about 95% of what we need comes from outside of our fence line.
Thank you. Let's turn our attention to China and their energy security picture. And so I'm going to turn it over to Brent. And would you give us a brief overview of where you think China's energy security position is?
Wow. The short answer to that is it's brittle. But they've been working for a very long time through things like the One Belt, One Road or Belt and Road Initiative to strengthen their access to markets and to isolate those sources to themselves, to tie them more directly to themselves. The other one, just to pivot a little bit, the key of this is actually the movement of the energy. And it's not just pipelines, it's ships. And so the Chinese also controlling a large number of strategically important ports. And those ports are going to be important as you move tankers across the ocean. Of course, you load and then you offload. And so the Chinese will continue to rely on overseas sources of petroleum, mostly, no matter how much they invest into nuclear power, and continue with coal for the reasons that were given earlier. You have to have, in order to have a resilient power distribution or generation, you have to have multiple sources. And so the Chinese they have a lot of vulnerabilities. But I think it's also worthwhile to reflect on that we have some significant vulnerabilities, both as a focus on the Navy, but also our deployed forces, reliance on overseas markets and sources, that the Chinese have an advantage that's also very dangerous for our operations. And then also looking at our own distribution system, I think it's worthwhile to kind of reflect. We have a fractured distribution system in the United States. The example of Texas being isolated is one example, but the West Coast moving over road or rail and the reliance on foreign shipping to keep the lights on here in the United States is a vulnerability the Chinese have taken note of. And some navalists will say the Chinese know Mahan better than we do in this regard. So I'll stop there if you want to go in any deeper part. But the short answer to China's energy resiliency is it's still very brittle.
So to come back to the World War II analogy, where our submarine force substantially reduced the amount of oil that Japan was able to get from Malaya and the Dutch East Indies. Today, China's, I don't know, 3/4 of their imported oil goes through the Straits of Malacca, which is an opportunity for us in the event of a conflict. On the other hand, so does the oil that goes to Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan.
Yes. It was very welcoming to hear that acknowledgement earlier during the keynote speakers' comments, and that is our allies like the Japanese, the South Koreans, in order to stay in the fight, or Taiwan, in order to stay in the fight, they have to have access to energy. And the only other reliable source, because of China's control of the shipping and the ports, and also market control in the Middle East and also from Russia, it's going to come from the United States. And we don't have the production capacity and the shipping capacity to meet their need in a wartime, a years-long kind of wartime. So that's the dilemma that's before us with our allies. And that's probably a whole nother discussion about how you actually get to that. And it's also one of the places where I think where small modular nuclear reactors can also provide a comparative advantage when we start talking about how do we mitigate our reliance on petroleum.
Would it be fair to say that China's dependence on imported oil, particularly from the Middle East, is a big driver in their Belt and Road and other similar initiatives?
And Africa and Latin America. But I think it should not be forgotten the amount of energy and investment that the Chinese and the Russians are making to develop that Central Asia sources, but also from Russia. It's not going to meet China's economic growth model needs. But if China is, as many are starting to kind of speculate, that this is going to be a very dangerous decade, they don't have to. They have to have just enough energy to maintain a war machine long enough to persevere. And at the end of the day, that's really the deciding factor for the Chinese, not sustained economic growth in the immediate future. It's what's the access to markets and energy in order to sustain a sustained wartime economy against the United States, most notably if it's over Taiwan. That's the most likely global war kind of scenario. It's going to be over Taiwan. And certainly we don't know what we need to sustain a wartime economy. We have not done that due diligence. Last time we did it, 1987, 650 tankers that were needed in ships to sustain that. We don't have that anywhere near that today, and we have a larger economy, more integrated. The Chinese are probably better at it, and they probably don't know everything that they would need to be confident that they would have the energy to sustain that wartime effort. It's one of the reasons why they're investing in nuclear power. It's one of the reasons they have a massive strategic reserve. They look at their strategic petroleum reserve in a very different way than we do. Our strategic petroleum reserve is not about having enough energy available in a crisis. It's about manipulating markets and pricing to avoid an oil crisis of the 70s again. And it's shaped in its completely different type of utility and what the Chinese are using it for.
Interesting. Well, you teed it up perfectly for Rita to talk about the magnitude and the ambitions of the Chinese nuclear program.
Sure. So Westinghouse is a global company. We have 10,000 employees all around the world and clients all around the world. And when we go and we speak to potential clients in developing as well as developed nations, they tell us that they already have tenders and bids from the Russians and the Chinese on their desk. Where the heck have you guys been in terms of approaching us for deploying new technology here? And so we have shown up, but we're clearly late. And fortunately, most of these nations understand that there are strings attached to the tenders that they have on their desks. And so they are looking for alternate options, but it is incumbent on nations like the US that have the best nuclear technology in the world to show up and not be arrogant and just sit and wait for somebody to come to us wanting our technology. So that's one, is that we need to make sure that we are in the same rooms as where for this market, it's competitors, but where our adversaries might be as well. So it's very important. But they're dominating. They are dominating.
Let's turn to our last topic, which is energy transition. Energy transitions can cause unexpected problems. As Dr. Juergen pointed out, the U.S. Navy, the Royal Navy, underwent a transition from coal to oil just before and during World War I. I'm reminded I recently read the newer biography of Admiral Leahy, who was XO of the new battleship USS Nevada in 1917, oil-fired battleship. And Admiral Leahy was very frustrated that Nevada couldn't be sent to Europe to join the Royal Navy in the North Sea because there was an inadequate supply of fuel oil in the UK at the time. And so the U.S. Navy could only send the older coal-fired battleships. So there's an energy transition with a bit of a hiccup. So I guess the question is, for Scott, we're trying to accomplish an energy transition. What is it? Is it happening globally? And how do we avoid bumps like that?
I have a few slides to show on this one, if we could pull those up. I think there's a perception that a transition is away from coal, oil, and gas to solar, wind, and batteries. If you were to ask most people, that's not what's going to happen, nor should it. So let me show you a couple of thoughts on this and what a transition is. First of all, I want to remind ourselves about poverty and the greatest form of violence. So if you look at all the countries in the world, their gross national income across the bottom against the electricity they consume, there's a very strong trend here, up and to the right. The more energy you have, the wealthier you become. The average income in the world is $13,000 per year. That's for the world. And that equates to about 7,000 kilowatt hours. The average energy consumption is half of that, which equates to about $22 a day. Average in the world for all these countries. It turns out about a third of the countries in the world consume less energy than my refrigerator every year per person, the average, than my fridge, okay? They're just emerging. They're living in pretty severe energy and economic poverty. The next tranche, if you will, a lot of the countries in the world are somewhere in this $300,000 to $20,000 a year range. They're developing. And then there's us, the rich world, the developed nations. We sit up here, large energy and large economies. This group wants to do what the emerging wants to emerge and become developing and developed. And the developing want to become developed. And if you look at that, you see that about 6 billion people in the world aren't here yet. You kind of cross that back over. There's just a few of us privileged folks living in prosperity. Most of the world is living at some level of poverty, from severe to emerging. The lights don't come on all the time. There isn't fuel. It's not stable. It's not secure to them. And this is the great challenge. Until we are able to address this, nothing else will happen, including climate. It just won't happen. And we're hearing this unified with one voice. I said to Senator Manchin's hearing just a couple years ago, we got to strive to be completely factual and factually complete. Factually completeness is hard, okay? We all have a bunch of facts we can pick out and share. Here's the world. This is the coal and oil consumption in the world. It's still going up. It's really dense, which means you get a lot of bang for the buck, but it makes a lot of CO2 when you burn it. Here's natural gas growing up tremendously, along with nuclear, still growing in the world. Russia and China lead. 70% of the reactors are being made there today. They're dense, bang for the buck, really dense nuclear, a lot denser by weight than anything, 1,000,000 times. They make less CO2. Hydro's growing still, solar, wind, and other things are growing, not dense. In other words, it takes a lot of infrastructure to collect them. But they don't make much CO2. These are the real trade-offs in the world. If we go back to the recession of 08-09 that Dan mentioned this morning, and midshipman, you were pretty young then, probably. There's a dip in global energy consumption. We're not moving around as much. The COVID recession, a deeper dip, but we're already consuming more energy in the world than we've ever consumed before. Okay. We're right back on that trail. We consume more coal and oil than everything else in the world combined today, by a lot. This isn't capacity, this is actual energy in exajoules. Pick your favorite unit. Nothing has gone down. Nothing. Not even hay. We consume more hay than we've ever consumed. There's more people, there's more animals. Nothing has gone down. We're just adding wedges of energy, which is good. It makes it for a diverse portfolio on the right better than on the left. But we're not transitioning away from anything yet. Okay? The transition isn't from carbon to solar and wind. The transition is to dense. It's from hay and wood and coal to oil, natural gas, and nuclear, hydrogen. Solar and wind will be a part of that portfolio. It's to dense. Unfortunately, dense has less carbon. We're doing ourselves a favor. We're decarbonizing with that transition. So what's the answer, Doc? This is kind of, I'll leave you with these thoughts. It's not binary. It's not carbon only. If you only focus on carbon, your only tool is a hammer. Okay, that's a piece of it. It's complicated. It's not simple. Energy security underpins economic security. You have secure energy, most reasonably secure economies have secure energy. That allows for what? Investment in the environment. Again, all the countries I've seen in the world and the research a lot of us have done, people living in poverty are not investing in the environment. The worst land, air, and waters in the world is where it's poor. They just can't afford to. And we're surrounded by fear. We just keep hearing it from all sectors. We should be scared. The beginning of wisdom is to do away with fear. Okay, we've got to take fear and set it over there. It's a powerful motivator to we who are driven by passion and emotion, humans. We've got to kind of set that aside. Emerging economies need something to get started. They need affordable energy. Developing economies, the ones in that big sector on that cross plot, they need reliable energy. They have some, but it's not reliable to them. And the developed sustainable energy, as the Secretary mentioned. We can afford to do that, as was mentioned about Germany. So it's that overlap space. We've got to, ironically and maybe counterintuitively, we have to accelerate economic growth in the world. Accelerate it. We got to grow that radical middle so that these countries can come through what we've done and be able to afford to then invest in the environment. It's that dual challenge, advance human flourishing and protect the environment. We can't just do one or the other. So that's a framework that I was talking about for transition. Thanks.
Thank you. So going off that last point, there's trade-offs between the environmental impact of energy, there's the impact on resiliency, and the impact on affordability. I guess my question for you, Curtis, is can we rely on markets to appropriately evaluate and choose the right trade-offs between those competing demands?
Yeah, it's a great question. I got a couple of slides. You might need to advance it here. I don't know if they'll. There we go.
There's the baton.
I mean, the reality is we do rely on markets. We have relied on markets for a long time, and we should rely on markets. But I want to address this question with 3 slides here, if I could. Let's see what we got. This has become my new favorite slide if you've never seen it. And it seems like there's a lot going on there, but this is the global exergy flux reservoir and destruction diagram. It shows all of the energy we could possibly use on one chart. Like everything you want to use is all right there. And all of the numbers, except for the numbers that are in circles, I'll talk about those, but all the numbers on here are in terawatts, a trillion watts. And keep in mind that to power all of human civilization, we need about 20 terawatts. As my colleague Patrick would say, if human society, human civilization on Earth were a light bulb, we'd be about a 20 terawatt bulb, right? That's how much we need. And so just to put that in context, I know it's behind me here, but over my right shoulder, you can see 162,000 terawatts of solar radiation coming in from the sun at any given point in time. And that gets dispersed around the globe into wind, 870 terawatts, waves, 60 terawatts, 90 terawatts, the area in green there, 90 terawatts is being converted to photosynthesis at any given point in time. And then that gets buried very slowly, 0.04, as buried hydrocarbons. And then the bubbles there are stores of energy, exergy reservoirs, usable energy. And inside the bubbles, it's measured in zetajoules. But you can see on the right side there, you're right. The bubbles of nuclear power, right? And just compare those to the bubbles of hydrocarbons in green. Just compare the magnitude of those bubbles. And by the way, the little bubble that you can't see on the corner there is seawater uranium, which we can extract and use as fission fuel. And it doesn't even fit on the page. And the big bubble on the bottom, of course, is fuel for fusion. And then down the other side there, you can see tides, some energy that we could get from tides, and then geothermal. But everything you could possibly want to use is on that chart. And so what do we use? Of course, for most of human history, we've relied on effectively competition and markets and existing technology to determine what we use and what we don't use. And as Scott was saying, like none of that energy comes particularly useful. You can't use the sun or the wind to move your car. You can't even use crude oil to move your car. All of that energy has to be converted in some way to be useful. And those conversions require energy. They actually destroy energy in the process. And so, of course, we're going to tend to gravitate towards those energy resources that provide the most energy and use up the least amount of energy in the process. I think, as Scott called it, bang for your buck. That's effectively what it is. And you can think about bang for your buck as energy return on investment, right? How much energy do you get out relative to the amount of energy that you put in to make that energy useful? And so we use coal, of course, because it has very high energy return on investment for producing heat, for thermal heat. If you just need heat, it's hard to beat coal, right? We use gasoline, gasoline for mechanical power because it has a high energy return on investment for producing, power through internal combustion engines. We use natural gas for heating water and space because of the energy return on investment. But when it comes to producing electric power, you can see the renewables can stack up quite well. Hydroelectric is amazing, right? It's got very high energy return on investment, and it also happens to be the lowest cost electricity source in the world. It's just there aren't a lot of places you can put hydroelectric dams, right? Wind actually stacks up pretty well as well, right? So wind is competitive to produce a kilowatt hour of electricity from wind. Wind has a pretty high energy return on investment. Nuclear power as well, and we could talk about some of the problems with wind and solar is that we don't just want to produce kilowatt hours. We got to produce kilowatt hours when we need them. Otherwise, it's not useful. And so to collect, and they're also very dispersed. So to really collect all that wind and solar energy, you need massive investments in transmission lines and other collection things, and that requires energy. And so that tends to reduce energy return on investment. And then if you have to store it, you lose some energy in the process of storing it, and you have to invest energy to get that stored energy back out. So that tends to reduce energy return on investment. And so, the marketplace is going to hash all this out very well. I'm fully confident of that the marketplace is going to find those energy resources that have the highest energy return on investment for particular end uses, and that's going to vary by region and time, right? The major problem with, of course, relying on the market, as we would call it in economics, is external costs, right? So health and environmental costs that aren't factored into the price based on energy return on investment alone. But the other thing to notice here, so here's estimates, the best estimates that I'm aware of the mean external cost of electricity supply. And this is in cents per kilowatt hour. So that's on top of whatever you think about the normal price of electricity being. And one of the things you'll notice, first of all, is that almost all of our energy sources have some external impact. As we say, we like to say there really is no clean energy. Well, they all have some external costs that aren't factored into the price. And it also doesn't break out cleanly between renewables and non-renewables, right? Non-renewables have negative externalities as well, right? So when we're really talking about policy and markets, ideally, the ideal policy would factor in these external costs into the prices of these various electricity sources or other energy sources. But otherwise, I'd say let the competitive market determine what energy sources we use and we don't use. That's the primary role of policy. And so I'll stop there. Yeah.
Well, let me follow up with that. At the present time, there is no market mechanism for pricing in these externalities. There's no carbon tax in the U.S. There is a carbon market in the U.K., but it's probably below a threshold to make a meaningful economic driver. So how do you factor in these externalities from a policy or a market point of view? How do you create a mechanism by which these externalities get accounted for?
Yeah, we haven't been very good about it in the U.S., right? So we don't adopt market-based incentives. They do in some other places, right? They've been better at it. But it's a political challenge because you're talking about literally taxing energy goods according to their external cost. And that's a political challenge. But, economists would tell you that whatever your goals are in terms of the environmental goals or anything else, the cheapest way to do that is to work through the market, right? You're going to get the outcomes at the lowest possible cost. And I would argue that we can't afford as a nation to achieve these goals at a higher cost than we have to. So, you need to make the case. Economists have made the case for example, for a carbon tax, which isn't the only negative externality. There are also local externalities. But it's up to our leadership to make the case for those market-based incentives. The alternative is that you don't work through the market and you kind of leave it to politics. But again, politics to me is kind of like Forrest Gump's box of chocolates. You never know what you're going to get, right? And not in a good and exciting way, right? So I don't know what the alternative is, right? But if you're going to leave it to politics, leave it to politics. But I don't know what you're going to get.
So back to Scott's point that you either drill for it or you mine it. As we do an energy transition, we're going from an energy system that is largely based, at least at the present time, on fossil fuels, which we now have achieved a modicum of energy self-sufficiency as a country. As we move into the energy transition, or we even try to reinforce our grid, we're going to be dependent on strategic materials that are not necessarily, or definitely are not here in the United States. And in fact, if you look at China, some materials, China has a monopoly on the mining, and for many of those that they don't have the monopoly on mining, they have the monopoly or near monopoly on processing. So for you, Brent, how are we going to cope with this vulnerability given an increasingly difficult situation with China?
Well, there's a lot in that. I'll start with rare earth elements, which are not rare. And it's really the fact that the Chinese have cornered that market because no one else wanted to get dirty, because it's an extremely caustic and it produces a huge amount of waste. And we, for environmental reasons and for clean air and clean water reasons, good reasons, we have not made that cost effective to have it in the United States. There was a caveat made years ago at one site in case of an emergency break glass. That was done in 2010 when the Chinese started to embargo or restrain exports of rare earths to Japan. And that had a direct impact on its economy, and it was a wake-up call to the world. And so it's really a question of how dirty do we want to be able to go, or how much of a cost for a much cleaner way of processing rare earths are we going to be willing to take. And we've been grudgingly doing that the last 10 years with, I guess, stimulus from Congress into the rare earth. Do we have the access to everything we need? No. And I think the Chinese still have the ability to dominate that market and to manipulate it, like they've done just recently with control of things like gallium. Moving to I guess I kind of wanted to get to another part of this, and that's with refining, if I may. In the near term, this transition, there's the longer term transition where nuclear power will become, I think, an inevitable dominant player because of the density, which I love that equation of the power density. It's hard to debate against it. The math and the physics all go towards it as the best. But in the next 5 years, we're kind of stuck with what we have. And the graph earlier about demand going up for petroleum, the world appetite for energy is going to outpace refining capacity.
Yes.
And that is a near-term problem. And I'm going to bring it back to the Navy, to the folks in uniform here in a minute, because that's really what animates a lot of my work lately. Without that refining, a refinery takes anywhere from 7 to 10 years in the United States to bring online a new one. These things are massive. We have also concentrated these down basically in the Gulf of Mexico, the Texas coastline area. That's a strategic vulnerability. If you're going to take out power that runs that, or the peoples that need to go and work at these refineries, it's easy for a cyber attack or for other nefarious actors, say the Chinese or even a terrorist organization, to really complicate, or a hurricane to take that out. The Iranians right now are dealing with this because their refining capacity is also geolocated, a juicy target for the Israelis as they contemplate a retaliatory strike. So we also have to look at diversifying geographically. Our refining capacity, which is too concentrated, our strategic petroleum reserve, too concentrated. Same area, by the way. It's not underground in the Louisiana and Texas area. So we need to also be very wise about the critical infrastructure, but also to diversify, and that comes with a cost. So we have to change the equation. I'm a little bit, my few years in the Pentagon, I'm getting a little PowerPoint envy over here, but we need to diversify. We definitely need to diversify geographically. So I don't have a map to show that.
Hand him the clicker, we'll give you some slides.
Yeah, maybe next time. But thankfully I didn't have to go down, because the nuke in me would have clicked in, I would have bored everyone with equations. So refining capacity is going down in the opposite direction that by all sources demand is going up. Our Navy, military writ large, but it's largely the Navy, half of its energy use is sourced overseas when it's deployed on the market. A market that the Chinese have a very sizable influence on. If our military finds itself in an operation the Chinese don't like, they have a lot of levers to apply the screws on us. We don't have the ships, that's an easy one. We don't have the port access, that's another easy one that they have. They also have relationships with many of these markets. And then when you get into the refining, if we were to surge our capacity and say, okay, well, we'll make up the difference. We don't. We have 134 and 30, depending on, I guess, the month that you look at, but I think right now, from June, the last one that I saw, all of our refineries are operating. Normally we have a few idle, and we're operating at a over 90% utility rate. Now, you say, well, that's 8%, 10% that you could surge. That's not how it works. You have to take offline, you do maintenance, you need to have some utility rate down around 75 to 85% is probably more ideal. So we don't have the capacity to surge, to demand. We also refine the wrong type of crude. This is the other thing. So when we were energy independent, it meant that we exported more than we actually imported. And we import heavy crude, which the vast majority of our refineries are tuned for. We produce, with the shale revolution, light crude. And so it's like light sweet. And if you've heard these terms, it has to do with chemical content in it. And sure, you can use a refinery in the United States that's tuned for a decision made like back in 2008, 2010 timeframe and before for heavy crude, because that's what we used to pull out of the ground. You could still do the light crude that we now pull out in shale. It's just your output is going to take a 20 to 35% decrement. So now if you find yourself in a crisis where you don't have access to markets overseas like we enjoy now because of the Chinese interference, we're going to have to ration who uses what energy at home. And it's going to be a shock because it will have a knock-on effect to the defense industrial base. It'll have an effect, a slowing effect also in military operations, because no longer will we be able to rely on the overseas market access in a crisis or in a war. And this is a dilemma that I'm not sure that we've really got our hands around. And I kind of come back to when I look at that powering national security, this is the dilemma in my mind that's the most pressing. And it's kind of in the refining piece.
I'm trying to remember, when's the last time we built a new refinery here in the U.S.?
So there was one that came online, but I think it's a little bit of cuteness with the word. From a greenfield, I don't have that number. It's been decades. Yeah. But taking and retooling or adding on refineries. So in California, they expanded. In California or in Texas, they also expanded. But what they did is they took from normal petroleum, crude oil processing, and they've looked at biodiesel or more renewable, which I'm not sure if that's the right term of art for it, but different alternative fuel sources. The problem is, same size refinery doing alternative fuels, you have a decrement in output. So while you may have another new refinery in California that is producing biofuel or renewable energy, it's actually producing less output. So the bottom line is we need more different sources, everything, but we need a lot more investment in our refining capacity, tuned to what we produce at home because it makes economic sense, but it also makes really good geostrategic sense too.
Thanks. So. Turning back to the energy transition for a moment, it's hard to conceive of a solution to the energy transition without nuclear power playing a significant role. So, Rita, I'd like to get your thoughts on that, and also how do maybe we are now, overcome the cost and the public perception issues that have slowed down nuclear power?
Sure. So I'll start with, nuclear power has been a clean energy source ever since its inception. And for decades, the industry was told, stay off the front page, don't be on the news, right? So we're notorious for not communicating the benefits of what we offer to society for a long time. In the past decade, that has definitely changed. We now are slowly getting more in the limelight and talking about the clean energy benefits, the reliability it provides, the sustainability that it can certainly provide. The energy security and the energy independence that it provides has come to the forefront over the past 2-3 years. And one example I'll share with you is that in the Ukraine, the Rivne plants relied on fuel for their VVER 440 plant. It's a type of nuclear power plant from Russia. And just after the invasion occurred, they came to Westinghouse and they said, can you design us this fuel so that we no longer have to rely on Russia for our fuel for our nuclear power plants? So Westinghouse, which is, by the way, one of the only commercial nuclear fuel fabricators in the world, stepped up to the challenge and developed this fuel for the plants and was very successful with a very high sense of urgency delivering to the Rivne plants in the Ukraine last October, so about a year from today, the fuel for those plants. And their leadership told us, thank you. Without this, we may not have survived the winter. Literally may not have survived the winter. So despite the circumstances that have brought some regions to this very stark realization, nuclear power does provide that energy independence and a sustained amount of energy security for decades. So these assets are 60, 80, and the SMR that we are designing is an 80-year design life, and then the licenses can be renewed for 20 to 40 years. So we're talking about a century-long asset, perhaps. And what has brought us back into the forefront over the past couple of years are the clean energy conversations, the conversations around decarbonization, the reality that you cannot get there 100% with just renewables. You need a sliver of nuclear, as the graphs and charts have shown. You need some nuclear in your portfolio to achieve these decarbonization targets, 2030, 2040, 2050. And so we are, I've been in the industry over 26 years, and this is the most exciting time that we have seen for commercial applications, for defense applications, for space. We have technologies that are being used for working with some projects with NASA as well. So it's a very exciting time, but it's also a very important time.
Can I add one other use? Propulsion, maritime propulsion.
Well, yes, that's where it started, right?
Yep.
With Admiral
Well, coming back
Rickover,
to in
so,
commercial,
right?
yeah.
Well, actually, let's key off on that point. Secretary Berger, I mean, the Navy launched the U.S., the world's nuclear power industry. Is there a role for us to play in this, I like to call it nuclear renaissance, that term's been overused, but is there a role for us to play in providing leadership in that area?
There's a line that goes down the middle because Navy has excellent stewardship, safety record. I am proud of someone who is affiliated with the institution that when you hear Navy and nuclear, that is a comfortable juxtaposition of words because of the precision and the excellence that comes with the practice of nuclear energy in the Navy. There is a national security mission that takes priority that has limited manning, technology, and resources there. And so at this moment, it is important to make sure that we are preserving that national security mission, prioritizing all of those applications, but carrying through on that stewardship and that safety that is the hallmark of Navy nuclear as we nationally go through a nuclear renaissance. And so there is certainly perspective, expertise, those types of value adds that can come from our institution. And I should note that the Army and the Air Force are also doing good work in this space. And so what you see across the Department of Defense is a really integrated approach to different pathfinders that will help us to make sure that we have a full laydown of what our future in this type of energy looks like, especially from a defense perspective. And so Air Force out at Eielson Air Force Base is really looking at what it means to operate in an austere environment and have true full ownership over technology, energy use, and execution. Army, through a partnership with Project Pele and the Strategic Capabilities Office, has looked at it, I'll offer at the other end of the spectrum, kind of in isolation at this point, to work through what it looks like to have a lab reactor and what they need to test and validate and experiment with. And we have come in with our RFI in the middle. Those are not the only places. We have partners in industry but there is a full continuum of what the laydown of technology manning and actual execution will look like, that I think nationally we are doing a good job of looking across that. And I just wanted to pick up on the very good education and communication point as well. It is a place where historically people remember accidents. And I will offer that The Simpsons had a real play in everybody thinking that they're going to glow green. And now as you think about what it means to manage waste and the clear benefits that come from this type of energy production and technology, we have an opportunity nationally to make sure that we are educating and communicating and demonstrating the communal value that this resource brings and how it brings us into the ecosystem on an international basis. Well, we have pledged to triple our contribution to the nuclear portfolio internationally by 2050. And so we are going, and we as the United States, not just the Navy. So we are doing our part, but the United States across sectors, across contributors are really coming together and working hard to make sure that we are looking across all contingencies to execute. And so we are playing our part. It is part of a whole. And I want to make sure that just like we started in this conversation, it starts and ends with mission and prioritizing that first in all of its forms and functions.
Thank you. Rita, you mentioned earlier the importance of using U.S. nuclear technology abroad. And certainly, you're seeing the South Koreans, the French, the Russians exporting reactors. How important is it that U.S. technology be used from a, one, safety point of view, and two, from a non-proliferation point of view?
It's extremely important, and I'll kind of go back to my days at DOE as Assistant Secretary for Nuclear Energy. It is extremely important because not only do we have the safest technology in the United States, but we have the most trustworthy organizations as well to work with, and we have the most transparent organizations. And so for countries that we want to export to that have signed up to adhere to the 123 agreements and Part 810 agreements, which mean basically in kind of layman's terms that they will use the nuclear technology for civilian and peaceful purposes. We are happy to work with them and export our technology to them. And we are recognized as the leaders in the world of this technology, but sometimes we're not necessarily the most affordable in that ternary diagram. We may not be the most affordable, but we're the most reliable and the most trustworthy. So it is absolutely important, and we do engage with a lot of different nations globally, and for the most part, they're very amenable to the 123 agreements and the Part 810 agreements that we must abide by.
Thanks. I think I'll ask each panelist to give us any parting thoughts, and then we'll go to Q&A. Scott, you want to start?
You bet. I feel like a debate. I just want to go back to questions X, Y, and Z real quick. Quick on markets. Yes, markets are critical. So are governments. That equals taxes. Governments can't pick winners. It fails when that happens. Governments need to know when to extract. They're not good at that. So this is the balance, I think, between government and markets in energy. On externalities, carbon pricing is interesting. Some things win there, but what if you price the value of land use or reliability? And nothing wins. So these are the balances. Transportation side, currently, as Dan pointed out, OPEC for oil, we're heavily reliant on that still, even though we produce a lot here, we won't forever. We could move transportation reliability to batteries, and then we'd be dependent on China. China owns the processing for over 80% of all those metals, not just the rare earths, the lithium, the cobalt, the other kinds of coppers and other things for solar, wind, and batteries. So that's a real big security question we have to be thinking about. And the last thing I'll leave you with is on this pace of transition, I just want to say this. We have time. And this will be a little heretical, perhaps. But we have time. Contrary to what you hear all the time is there's no time to think. Well, there's always time. The leading body on climate change, the IPCC, their AR6 2021 report, Working Group 1, which looks at the impacts of climate change. Not the warming, the impacts. Chapter 12, table 12.12. Go look at it. It's not being talked about anywhere. It looks at all of the impacts of climate change. What has left the window of historical? Very little. What is still in the range of what's happened in the past? Almost everything, including typhoons and hurricanes, contrary to the Helene and Milton. Almost everything hasn't left the window of historical yet. This is the leading climate group in the world. It's the top people. Go look at the table. We have time to think and work towards the kinds of balancing that we're talking about here. And that gives me comfort. It makes me hopeful as we go forward.
Thanks. Secretary Berger?
Yes, so I will sum up some of our good conversation here looking at requirements, resourcing, markets, and outputs. And so one of the greatest values that the Department of the Navy brings to this entire problem set is that we can set the requirements because we are huge energy consumers We are driven by the national security mission, which comes pretty high in the hierarchy of the work that we do, and it sets the conditions for what we need because we are constantly anticipating our environment to meet mission. We have a lot of resources. We don't have all the resources in the world, and so we look across a variety of relationships. So whether it is private sector resourcing that we see coming from congressional priorities, allocations that we see through the budget process, we start to move forward on that. We've seen things like the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, the Inflation Reduction Act, the CHIPS Act, building on other specific energy legislation as well, but showing how we're getting to some of the renaissance that we're seeing and some of the realization on the infrastructure. And so that is a place that we can play so that we are actually generating those outcomes that we need to see to assure our national security mission. I'll go back to your slide, which I thought was quite poignant on poverty. Poverty is where we see a lot of conflict as well. Conflict increases our mission set, and we see that when we have humanitarian assistance and disaster relief situations coming from too much, too little water, extreme heat, extreme storms, all of those things that we see impacting energy as well and exacerbated by it. And so as I will say, time is of the essence as we do this work because we see these types of impacts on the people who are most vulnerable every day. That is part of our mission set, and so we're going at the speed of urgency, which is pretty fast some days, as we saw as recently as this week. And so it is something that is driving us, and we've got to take every second we can to gain that advantage against a threat.
Thanks. Curtis?
Just a couple comments. It's clear that, promoting energy security is going to require public sector investment. Whether that's upgrading the grid, whether that's investing in expansion of the grid to support renewables, et cetera. But the question is, where is that money going to come from, right? That's a huge question we haven't talked a lot about. And my concern is that we will continue the business as usual case of borrowing money to support it. We've got $35 trillion debt. We've got, for 2024 alone, the projections are a deficit of $1.8 trillion, and this is a good year where we are not directly involved in major wars, and we've got a good economy, so that can't continue. Here I would quote the great Taylor Swift, who says, "I think I've seen this film before, and I didn't like the ending," right? So no great nation has survived accumulating debts beyond a certain point, and the U.S. will be no exception. So here's an opportunity in the environmental arena, as I've said, to kind of kill two birds with one stone, right? You can raise revenue as a basic principle of public finance, that public sector spending should be paid for by the people who benefit from that, and that is energy users, and you can do that through appropriate charges to energy users. Whether that will be the case or not, I don't know. That's a question to be continued, but we can't continue to do it simply through more borrowing. I'll start there.
Thanks. Rita?
So a lot of great points have been touched on already, but what I want to elaborate on a little bit is the beyond electricity benefits of nuclear. Scott talked about industrial heat and process heat and district heating, which is very, very important, and it's not exploited enough when we come and talk about commercial nuclear power. So some of our technologies, our reactors, are being used to provide district heating to communities. They can be used to desalinate water in areas where right now it's a very fossil-intensive process. They can be used for process heat, for the chemical processing and the ammonia and steel and concrete. And so our reactor technologies are being used for those applications around the world, but we did not talk about what nuclear does in terms of probably touching at least half of you, if not all of you, and that is to generate life-saving medical isotopes. And so if you or a family member has ever had a cancer diagnostic or a treatment or even some medical diagnostics, you have benefited from nuclear medicine, and those radioisotopes have been generated from nuclear power plants. Why that's even more important today is many of those isotopes come from Russia. And so it is important that we are able to generate those isotopes in country, and the existing power plants in this nation can do that, and some of them have started to do that. Finally, you didn't ask me what keeps me up at night, but I'm going to answer that question, and that is that this nuclear industry will not have enough resources to operate the plants, and before we even get there, to operate the existing plants, to construct the new plants, and to operate the new plants. So for those of you that are considering coming into private industry after your service, we welcome you to join us. Navy nukes are amongst our best employees because of the training and the expertise that they bring to the industry. So thank you very much for what you do, and look forward to working side by side with you sometime soon.
Yeah, oh, thanks. So 2 final thoughts. The first one on China, to kind of bring back to the first question. They are a Goliath in the market space writ large, but even also considering in the energy market access and also the movement of that energy on tankers and the control of the ports. And so any kind of looking forward in the near term has to be very much founded in how do you build in access, resilient access for U.S., but also our key strategic allies in Asia, this most notably Japan, South Korea, but they're not the only ones that will have a significant impact on deterring China or persevering in a crisis or winning in a war, which would likely take years if it were to pass. The second, and an optimistic, is on moving energy and moving trade, which are key to our sustained prosperity and also our economic and strategic security. There is an opportunity in here to use small modular reactors in commercial utility to create a comparative advantage and to let market forces prevail where we regain our maritime industrial strength, which will secure our access to the energy and the ability to move it even from, say, the Gulf of Mexico, from Texas, up to, even in the United States, to New England. So I see this as a very interesting American comparative advantage just on the cusp, and Congress is already taking note. You've got the ADVANCE Act, which has already come to pass. You've got a lot of interest in the Ships for America Act, which hopefully will be formally put on the table in November, setting conditions for investment. And I think this is one of the ways that we get to powering our national security very effectively and mitigating the threat from China.
Thank you. We've got a few minutes left for Q&A, so if people want to queue up at the microphones, and I've got a few online questions.
Yeah. This was the cheap version, so because I couldn't afford gold.
Hi, good morning. Thanks for your time. Lee Baird, class 94 from this great institution. So, but I do want to ask, I'm not sure who exactly in the panel, maybe the gentleman to the left is, since we did all these historicals, how are we doing historically with our allies and partners? And, are we gaining them or losing them in the energy space? And can you talk about worldwide and then specifically about South America? And if you want to even go even further south to Antarctica, but I'm not sure how well those emperor penguins are to negotiate with. So.
Did you say you were class of 94?
Yes, sir.
Yes, well, 94 as well, so the best year.
So I'll see McGarvey's tonight, right?
Yes. Well, I'll be here tomorrow for the 30th. I'm very delinquent. First year. So I think Merit might have a lot more to offer that's very topical, but from the Japanese, which I have a lot more experience in the recent past, and also after Fukushima. And I'd also say trying to supply LNG, which was a great conversation earlier in the day. A lot of awareness that we have to increase our port connectivity, but also on the other side and then the shipping. And so preferably, we'll have more U.S. ships moving LNG in the future. But I think, thank you, Putin, for waking up the Western world to the vulnerability through our energy.
Yeah, so we once had a fairly robust, smaller platform, nuclear surface Navy. and it went away, and I don't recall why it did. Is there any possibility or any thinking of reinvigorating or looking at it? I mean, has the small modular reactor changed any of the thinking? I know it's not necessarily transferable to a shipboard platform, but is there any consideration in going back to other than carriers?
So when I was on active duty, we had several nuclear power cruisers. And the decision to not continue with them was twofold. One was the cost effectiveness equation wasn't there. Clearly, the benefits for a carrier and even more so for a submarine were the numbers penciled out quite well. But for a surface combatant, it didn't. Second of all, there was an issue of manning. At the time in the 80s, we were having trouble having adequate number of nuclear trained personnel in the Navy, and we needed them to man the subs and the aircraft carriers, and there really weren't enough trained nukes to go around to man the cruisers. Brent, you want to add to that?
So looking from like where we are now and going forward with the small modular reactors, I see them more use in commercial, maybe logistics ships. It comes into, and it's the quality of the fuel and the energy density. For a submarine, which I was a submariner for 27 years, having that very highly enriched and dense energy source is great for military use. Plus, it's also, you don't want to be cutting your ships open and going into the shipyard to refuel. And you design warships to a different purpose than commercial. So I think both the density of the fuel that's in question and the designs of these small modular reactors in question, which can have a very low manning requirement, don't really translate very well into, say, a cruiser-type platform or an aircraft carrier, certainly not a submarine, because of the space and the energy that you want to be able to produce over a long period of time. So my money is on the small modular reactors, maybe in large tankers, for example, but certainly the ultra-large container ships. And there's a military use there, of course.
I'll just jump in.
Yeah.
In partnership with Research, Development, and Acquisition, which sets a lot of the requirements for our shipbuilding, along with naval reactors if it's going to involve nuclear. At this point, due to some of the other points that we discussed earlier in terms of manning technology and where we're going in these pieces, adding another one to the mix at this point isn't where we are. We're seeing a lot of the experimentation and utilization in the commercial sector in terms of smaller crafts and going that way, but we are pursuing the shore energy and sticking with the aircraft carrier submarine model for where we are right now.
We only have time for one more question, I'm afraid.
Good morning, I'm Lieutenant James Bersati. I'm an instructor at Nuclear Power School and a nuclear trained surface warfare officer. The U.S. Energy Information Administration's data indicates that of all the electricity generated in the country in 2023, only 41% actually reached customers, while 59% was lost in transmission. What are we doing to improve our grid's efficiency, and could more geographically dispersed power generation, like what small modular reactors could provide, assist in our grid's efficiency, redundancy, and reliability?
So I'll answer the last part with a yes. And part of why SMRs, as well as even smaller microreactors, which are 5 megawatts, are being explored is precisely to almost sidestep being beholden to the existing grid. So we have interest from clients that are saying, I want this all for myself, and essentially behind the meter, if you will, applications. So our eVinci microreactor is perfect for that. And it's it's being designed for remote operation to be deployed in remote areas, remote communities, even could be used for disaster recovery applications. But it's essentially, we're not going to sit around and wait for the grid to be fortified. We can operate almost autonomously with our own infrastructure. That's one piece. The other is there are a lot of coal plants in the U.S. that are slated for retirement. And nuclear power is primed and ready to come in right behind and allow that community to stay intact with a little bit of reskilling for nuclear power and have a nuclear power plant deployed there and take advantage of the sticks and wires that are already there and still robust. So we don't want to lose the infrastructure that currently is in good shape, but we can come in and retrofit almost, if you will, retiring plants with a cleaner energy source.
Yeah, and the brownfield construction replacement of existing fossil plants with either converting them to natural gas, if gas capacity exists, or nuclear is a very cost-effective way to take advantage of grid, water, infrastructure that's already there. Okay.
Well, thanks to the audience for the great questions, and I want to thank our panelists. It's a rare opportunity to get such experts and leaders together. Thank you all for your time today. This was a fascinating conversation. Please join me in a round of applause for our panelists, please. And as a small token of our appreciation, we present you with the Naval Institute Press Book, The Neptune Factor, Alfred Thayer Mahan, and the Concept of Sea Power by Nicholas Lambert. We'll now take a 45-minute lunch break. Lunch will be served on floors 1 and 3. We have seating on floors 1, 2, and 3. And please see a staff member if you need help finding a place to seat. And we'll be back here promptly at 12:30 for the afternoon panel, which is titled Rebuilding the Defense Industrial Base, Strengthening the Arsenal of Democracy for Today's Global Challenges. Thank you all.